Let's talk a little bit about sword grips. Hey folks, Schola Gladiatoria here. Now, sword grips are a complicated topic. This is not a complicated video, it is a short video. That's right, unusual for this channel. But something I noticed recently, I have been testing a bunch of different swords, a bunch of different prototypes and some gloves as well. And I use different gloves. And something I've noticed which people might not have necessarily noticed, and I think some manufacturers are not necessarily aware of, is that when they make decisions about what to put on a sword grip, it can make or break your user experience of a sword. Now obviously when we look at historical swords, I've got various antiques here to hand. Okay, here's a Persian Shamshir. This is an ivory grip, okay, with silver fittings. Then we've got a Chinese sword which has a form of interlaced cord on the grip. Very nice grip on that. But then we've got another replica Chinese sword here which has a form of horn, I believe, on the grip with brass fittings. And then we've got a European sword which has leather on the grip, and so on and so forth. We find obviously Japanese swords famously have, the Suka has a Ito silk wrap. So there are many different types of grips that have been put on swords throughout history and are still put on sword grips today. But if we take training weapons, for example, if we just narrow this down to a second, down to HEMA weapons, okay? Here we've got a feather from Kvetten, and the different feather makers, this is just one type of sword for one type of modern activity, okay? So that narrows down the data set hugely. We find a whole different bunch of wraps put on feather grips, from leather, stitched leather, to various different types of cord, to some cords which are coated, and so on and so forth. They're the most common types of cover, but the different types of cord can make a huge difference to your grip. Now, the problem is, what feels really grippy and nice in the bare hands is not always the same as what feels really grippy and nice in gloves, and annoyingly, different gloves work differently with different grips. And so I've been testing a bunch of different swords, both prototypes and production models recently, and I have a selection of different gloves. I won't name all the different gloves I use, but they've basically all got either forms of leather, artificial leather, suede, or fabric on the interior of the gloves. And of course then we've got bare hands as well, because when I demonstrate drilling in class, I'm very often not wearing gloves at all, I've got bare hands. And the problem is, whether a grip material is good or not, in other words, whether it functions well, unfortunately completely depends on whether I've got bare hands or whether I'm using suede gloves, fabric gloves, leather gloves, artificial leather gloves, what type of leather, what type of surface, whether it's shiny leather or matte leather, whether it's very flexible leather, or, all of these variations can mean that. So for example, I've got one sword, and I won't name it because it's part of a later review process, but I've got one sword which in the bare hands feels absolutely lovely, and I thought, this has got the nicest grip on it. I tried to use it with my sparring gloves and I couldn't bloody hold the thing. My hands were sliding and slipping all over the place because the particular interaction between the leather of those gloves and the surface of that particular cord wrapped grip meant it was as slippery as trying to hold on to an eel. Another sword which has beautiful cord wrap, and I thought, this has got lots of texture, this will be great to grip. It wasn't that great, so I applied beeswax to it to make it sticky, and then it was great. There is an additional thing as well, and that is to do with the grip shape and cross section. So one of the problems with gloves versus no gloves, and also different types of gloves compared to each other, is they give a different grip thickness preference, okay? So a grip that feels absolutely great in your bare hand, if you put one glove on, it might feel great as well, or it might feel a bit too big. If you put another glove on, it might feel way too big. And this all relates to the thickness of the material and the flexibility of the material of that glove. So, I'm not going to bang on about it, I think you've probably got the point now. The problem is that I think that some manufacturers of swords, they test that grip material with the gloves that they use but they don't necessarily test it either with bare hands or they don't test it with other gloves as well. And you know, in HEMA we've got several different glove manufacturers for sparring gloves, for just longsword or whether you're looking at saber or rapier or whatever else. So the problem is, manufacturers, this is advice basically to sword manufacturers, when you decide upon a grip material, try that grip material with a variety of different gloves. Because I have to say, some companies, some quite big companies making feathers at the moment, your grips are horrible with certain gloves. So you've got to test them with a variety of gloves. How do those gloves interact with those grips? Because it's a really, really major thing. And as I say, in one case, one of the feathers I tried to use recently was literally unusable with the gloves that I tried to use it with. I couldn't, it revolved in my hand slipped up and down. It was unusable with those gloves. So very important when you're deciding on a grip cross section, width and surface, you know, covering in other words, test it with a whole bunch of different gloves, test it with a whole bunch of different people. Because just because it works for you, with your hands, with your gloves, it might not work for the other 10 people in your sparring group. I hope this has been useful to someone out there. Not terribly interesting, I know, but I think it is an important topic for people who are sparring, not just with HEMA, but it could be any other swordsmanship. It is an important topic, and that grip, it can be underappreciated, but it is the interface between you and the weapon and has a very real effect on how well you do in your sparring and how much, therefore, you enjoy it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon on the channel for another video about swords or something related. Cheers, folks.